Forrest Gump is an interesting movie. It's really well loved, but there's sort of this theme throughout the whole thing that I recognized when I was digging into Stoicism, that, his mother was always kind of like, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Like, you're kind of just wandering around like a leaf in a breeze.
Yeah.
And then he met Lieutenant Dan, who was like the polar opposite, which basically like, no, there's a destiny, there's a fate. I'm going to die on this battlefield. Forrest Gump actually saved him from death, but Dan didn't think that was a good thing. He was like, you a-hole, I wanted, this was my destiny. You robbed me of my fate. Yeah.
Prevented him from going to Valhalla, as the Vikings would say. Yeah.
Essentially, yeah, that's essentially what his mentality on it was. And he had like his whole lineage of his ancestors were dying in battle. And it's like he had this sort of idea that this was going to be my thing. I'm going to die in battle. And it took him a long time to really come to peace with the fact that maybe it was a good thing that Forrest Gump saved him. But then there was this apex at the end of the movie where he's talking to the grave of his wife, his dead wife, Forrest Gump, and he says that, he says, I don't know if life is like a box of chocolates and you never know what you're going to get. I don't know if we're just kind of floating around, and I don't know if there's fate, but maybe both is happening at the same time.
Yeah,
and it's like that's such a hard thing to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
What that means.
I never thought about Lieutenant Dan being some kind of like a shadow to Forrest Gump, but now I really like it. How did it end with Lieutenant Dan? So I know he became like kind of nihilistic for a while and really angry.
Yes.
Where did he end off? Yeah.
So he became nihilistic and was like drinking and doing all kinds of crazy shit. And then basically Forrest Gump became a fisherman, and Lieutenant Dan promised him he'd be his deckhand if he, jokingly, like, you're not going to become a fisherman. Yeah. The day you become a fisherman is the day I become your deckhand. But he followed his word, and when he became a fisherman, he showed up. And then there was a scene where they were hauling up the net, and Lieutenant Dan was kind of looking at the sunrise or the sun. I think it was a sunset. He was looking at the sunset, and he says to Forrest, he says, I never thanked you for saving me.
Yeah.
And this is probably like 10 years later.
Right. He found some kind of meaning there. Yeah. And I think that is that, because it seems like his fate, right? And you said it, this really ties into the Vikings, the ancestors, right? They all died on the battlefield. It really felt like his path. Yet does he have a different path, right? Is he unique, right? He doesn't need to follow that pathway. And then that it's not easy. And it's actually much harder then to not die on the battlefield. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's easier to die on the battlefield.
Yeah.
If you're convinced that that's your fate.
Right.
And it took 10 years for him. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but it was probably like 10 years for him to psychologically evolve himself to being okay, and more than okay, at peace with that fate that he had in his mind, dying, that dream of him dying on the battlefield, just that whole image of himself dying, and accepting that actually maybe there's something better here for me.
Yeah. And that Forrest needed to save him. And there's all kinds of, what are the interconnected pieces of fate that it then led to. Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. And the whole purpose of that movie is like Forrest is this, he's basically an idiot, right? Like he's not a smart guy, kind of like Dostoevsky's Idiot book, but has really pure intentions.
Yeah.
And because of the pure intentions, despite him being taken advantage of at times and this and that, things worked out okay for him.
So if the way I always take the myths is like a dream, right? So there's the part of yourself that is Forrest Gump, and is it almost being a little bit stupid with your optimism? But then you need that part of yourself. You don't need to be Forrest Gump, but you need to have Forrest Gump within you somewhere.
Right. Well, he's basically a naive child.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Right. That's essentially what he is, and somehow stumbles through life.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know how, but I've watched the movie like 20 times, but I don't know how.
And then you have to come to terms with your own internal Lieutenant Dan as well. Yeah.
That's the other thing too.
Yeah.
But it's so funny to me that, you can have, that anyone can have this idea of fate and that this is how my life's going to go, even if it's resulting in death.
Yeah.
And then becoming nihilistic because that didn't come into fruition.